What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 17 top 40 wide receiver rankings. If you guys are watching this video, I'm assuming you have made the Fantasy Football Championships, so congrats. Hopefully these videos help you guys go out and bring home that championship. If you guys enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe. Any questions, feel free to drop them down below. But let's just dive right into the rankings here, starting off in Tier 1. I feel like this has to be a one-man tier. It is going to be Jamar Chase, even in a not-so-great matchup here against the Broncos. I feel like he has just separated himself from the rest of the field here. He is the wide receiver 1 in points per game, and not only just the wide receiver 1, he is the wide receiver 1 by over 4 PPR points per game, so he's blowing the rest of the competition out of the water. Jamar Chase, my Tier 1 wide receiver. Now moving into Tier 2, I have 4 guys in this tier. We're going to go Nico Collins going up against the Ravens. Really like this matchup. They are top 2 in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. Nico Collins maybe hasn't had like the nuclear games since he's returned from injury, but Tank Dell out. He's going to be the focal point of this offense. I like Nico Collins as my wide receiver 2. Then I have Puka Nacua going up against the Cardinals. Not a great week 15, 8 for 56. Not terrible for PPR. That's actually his worst full game of the season, which just goes to show how impressive, he has been when he's been out there for the full game. So still very high on Puka. After Puka, I have Justin Jefferson going up against the Packers, coming off just a nuclear week 16, 10 for 144 and 2 touchdowns. He's been super impressive over his last 3 games, 32 plus points in 2 of his last 3. If you want to make the argument for him being higher, not going to push back. I mean, at this point, right, all these dudes are locks in your lineup. Then I have Amon-Ra St. Brown going up against the 49ers. The Lions, as per usual, are way up there in their implied point total. They are top 3. Amon-Ra solid over his last 2, 37.3, and then 19 PPR points. Now moving into a pretty large tier 3 here. And for me, this was like the toughest group of wide receivers to rank. Obviously, I have them all in the same tier for a reason, but we're going to start off this tier with Terry McLaurin going up against the Falcons. It's a good matchup on paper. The Falcons are top 4 in points per game allowed to wide receivers, and Terry, pretty much outside of the first 2 weeks, and then maybe 1 or 2 down games since then, has been insanely consistent, getting into the end zone at a high rate, 17 plus PPR points in each of his last 4, did not have a good matchup in week 16 and still came through with a really strong performance. Then I'm going to go with JSN going up against the Bears. And at some point, we just have to vault JSN up the rankings here. In his last 7, he is averaging 21.8 points per game. So he has been, feasting in this offense. Looks like the clear-cut wide receiver 1. Not a great matchup against the Bears. They are bottom 7 in points per game allowed to wide receivers, but I don't think it's going to matter a ton. He's commanding volume, and he is producing on those targets. After JSN, I'm going to go with A.J. Brown going up against the Cowboys. Now, this is somewhat dependent on the health of Jalen Hurts. Left week 16 with a concussion, but in his last 2, he has put up 25 and 23.7. So this is about where he would slot in if Hurts was healthy. If Hurts ended up missing this game, he'd probably drop to the bottom of this tier, maybe even potentially into tier 4. Maybe with the volume could be there for Kenny Pickett, but in terms of actual quarterback play, didn't look great out of Kenny in week 16. After A.J. Brown, going to go with Mike Evans going up against the Panthers. Since he has come back from injury, he's averaging 19.5 points per game. Had a couple of boom games, 3 games where he's sitting around 5 for 70. So some, games that haven't maybe been amazing, but still decent in terms of PPR format. Buccaneers have the highest implied point total going up against the Panthers. So I think Mike's going to have a nice game here. Then I'm going to roll with Devontae Adams as my wide receiver 10. He has been feasting as of late. In his last 3, 25.9, 42.8, and 19.8 PPR points. He's also being force-fed at least 11 targets in each of his last 4 games. My wide receiver 11 is going to be Brian Thomas Jr. going up against the Titans. Super happy to rank him this highly, someone I really liked, and has continued to ball out even with the quarterback change here. In his last 2, he has just gone nuclear in both. Week 15, 10 for 105 and 2 touchdowns. Then followed that up with 9 for 132 and a touchdown. You can make the argument I'm actually underranking him here, but in your normal size leagues, he's obviously going to be a lock in your lineups. Then I have CeeDee Lamb going up against the Eagles. This is just a tough matchup here for Lamb. The Cowboys are tied for the lowest implied point total, all the way down with the Giants, which is never a good sign. CeeDee Lamb, on the other hand, has found some consistency here, 17 plus points and 90 plus yards in each of his last 3 games. So obviously a super talented wide receiver, but the situation, the matchup, not great here in week 17. A couple more guys in this tier. I have T. Higgins going up against the Broncos. The Surtain matchup, somewhat concerning. Could he split between Jamar Chase and T. Higgins? It's up in the air, but T. Higgins has still just been a super consistent option. 17 plus points in 5 of his last 6. We know the Bengals going to put up a ton of passing volume. They're willing to kind of run up the score due to their suspect defense. T. Higgins has been taking advantage of that all season long. And then my last guy in this tier, Ladd McConkey, going up against the Patriots. He has scored at least 14 PPR points in each of his last 5. And he's gone for at least 80 yards in 4 of his last 5. So it hasn't necessarily been hitting in the touchdown department, but everything else has been there for Ladd. And I don't think there's like something about him that's limiting that touchdown upside. Kind of just been somewhat unlucky as of late. So Ladd McConkey going to close out this tier. Now moving into tier 4, going to start off with Courtland Sutton going up against the Bengals. Sutton was kind of tough for me to rank. I really wrestled between tier 3 and tier 4. He has kind of cooled off over the last couple of games, but still holding a decent floor. He has scored at least 10 PPR points in each of his last 8 games, plus definitely could take advantage of this Bengals matchup. After Sutton, going to go with Malik Neighbors going up against the Colts. His floor has really held steady, even on just an offense that has been really rough. He's been force-fed targets, 28 targets in each of his last 2 games. And in his last 6, maybe he hasn't had, super consistent ceiling games, but in his last 6 games, he has caught at least 5 passes and gone for at least 60 yards. So if you play him, it's very unlikely that he just completely falls flat in your lineup. Maybe he's not going to give you 20 plus. I know he did in week 15, but that's kind of just where we're at with Neighbors. Super talented wide receiver, just in a terrible offensive situation with the Giants. After Neighbors, I'm going to go with George Pickens going up against the Chiefs. Would expect him to return from that hamstring injury. Believe he has missed 3 games. When he has been out there with Russ, he's averaging 16 PPR points per game. So a mid-tier wide receiver 2, coming off an injury, I feel like is a fair spot to have him. Then one guy who's kind of just quietly balling out for fantasy, Keenan Allen going up against the Seahawks. I originally had him a little bit lower, and it's probably just due to him, having a rough start to the season, not looking great. But this is week 17. This is all or nothing right here. So if I can start a guy who has scored 20 plus PPR points in 4 of his last 5, I'm going to do it. He's being force-fed the ball, 26 targets combined over his last 2 games. So Keenan Allen, the man's producing, giving you 20 plus on a consistent basis. Got to give him some respect this week as my wide receiver 18. Someone who's kind of trending in the opposite direction, Tyreek Hill going up against the Browns. Now, this is a good matchup. The Browns are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. And coming into the year, you'd think Tyreek Hill with a top 3 matchup, in the fantasy football championship. I mean, he is a set it and forget it option. Unfortunately, that's just not where we're at this point. He's actually gone for under 40 yards in back-to-back games. It definitely just seems like he's kind of taken a step back here. Obviously, his full season numbers are going to be skewed with not having Tua early on in the season, but even with Tua back, hasn't been super consistent. And even this past week, he had a couple of touchdown opportunities, would have been tough plays, but just could not come through with it. So Tyreek Hill, unfortunately, my wide receiver 19. And we're going to wrap up this tier with Drake London going up against the Commanders. We saw Michael Penix for the first time. If you just look at the box score, it doesn't seem great, but I do think he played better than the box score would kind of lead you to believe. Obviously, the interception, if you guys saw it, just Kyle Pitts completely dropping the ball, just pretty much catching it and then just tossing it right into the defender's arms. So that doesn't look great. It was also just a game where the defense dominated. I think they had at least a couple of touchdowns on defense. So Penix was not asked to do a ton. I do think he's going to have, more of a workload on his shoulders this week. Going up against the Commanders, they are 4.5-point dogs. Drake London, 8 targets, 5 for 59 in week 16. Still pretty interested in these Falcons weapons with Michael Penix at the quarterback position. Then looking at tier 5, going to go Jordan Addison going up against the Packers. He just continues to log solid performances. He's averaging 20.3 points per game in his last 6. We know he had a couple of those huge boom games, but also showing you he does have a pretty decent weekly floor. After Addison, going to stay in the division with DJ Moore going up against the Seahawks. Hasn't been super pretty, but he's held a nice floor as of late, and in his last 6 is actually averaging 17.4 points per game. So someone who I still think is relevant as a back-end wide receiver 2. Then I'm going to go with Zay Flowers going up against the Texans. Very interesting kind of season here. Since week 9, he was kind of stuck in this 10 to 12 point like purgatory where he was not breaking 12 points, but also was hitting double digits. Week 15 finally got out of that, went 5 for 100. Don't hate this matchup here against the Texans. Think Zay Flowers is a nice back end wide receiver too. Then a wide receiver here who just keeps sticking around. Every year we're going to write him off. It's Adam Thielen going up against the Buccaneers. Solid matchup here. Bucs are top 10 in points per game allowed to wide receivers. And you look at Thielen's last four: 23.9, 19.2, 10.1, and 15.3 PPR points. Bryce Young is playing well. Adam Thielen, I have him as a wide receiver 2 this week. A couple more guys in this tier. Cooper Kupp is my wide receiver 25. Honestly, have a super tough time ranking him because 2 weeks ago, he looked like an auto start, a mid-tier fantasy wide receiver 1. Really had only had one bad healthy game. Since then, or at least, over the past couple of weeks, just tanked back-to-back weeks. He scored under 6 PPR points in 3 of his last 4. So we're in this spot where if he goes 10 for 100 and a touchdown in week 17, I would not be shocked. But this is the final game, right? How can you fully trust a guy who has only hit 6 points in 1 of his last 4 games? It's a tough situation if you have him. Like I said, I have him as a high-end wide receiver 3, but a super tough guy to rank. Could see him completely flopping again, but could also see him just completely bouncing back, to his production earlier on in the season. And then the last guy in this tier, Jawan Jennings going up against the Lions. On paper, it's a good matchup. The Lions are top 6 in points per game allowed. Jawan Jennings just has not been producing as of late. Under 10 PPR points in 4 of his last 5. He has been a little bit boomer bust. We know he has a pretty high weekly ceiling, but kind of similar to Kupp, tough to fully trust a guy when he just has not been giving you nice numbers in recent weeks. Moving into tier 6, going to start off with Calvin Ridley going up against the Jaguars. Good matchup here against his former team, top 5 in points per game allowed. Ridley, production has kind of been hit or miss as of late, coming off his best game since week 10, but still wasn't an amazing performance. He did play the Jaguars a couple of weeks ago, was targeted a lot, but didn't necessarily come through fantasy-wise. So wide receiver 27, I think is a fair ranking. Then I have Devonta Smith going up against the Cowboys. Jalen Hurts obviously going to factor in here. Devonta Smith, though, had one boom game a couple of weeks ago, but has only hit 14 PPR points once out of his last 5 games. Going to go with Garrett Wilson up next, going up against the Bills. This has kind of been a tough season for Garrett Wilson. Early on, seemed like he didn't really have the rapport with Aaron Rodgers, was still commanding a lot of volume, but wasn't super efficient. Then Devontae Adams came in, actually played pretty well. Since then, Devontae has just kind of run away with the wide receiver 1 spot. Garrett Wilson has hit 60 receiving yards 1 time in the last 6 weeks, or his last 6 games. And then also the Jets, probably not going to have a great offensive performance, have the 4th lowest implied point total going up against the Bills. Couple more guys in tier 6. Going to go Jameson Williams going up against the 49ers, coming off a nuclear week 16, 5 for 143 and a touchdown. The interesting thing about JMO is kind of expectedly early on in the season, he was pretty boomer bust. Not someone who's going to command a lot of volume, but could always rip off a big play, give you a solid fantasy performance. So early on, he had a lot of decent games, but also had a couple of just complete floor performances where if you started him, he was pretty much giving you nothing in your lineup. As of late, though, he's found some consistency, at least 9 PPR points in each of his last 6 weeks. Now you might be saying 9 PPR points, that's a pretty low bar. And it is, but for someone who can go 5 for 143 and a touchdown, if he's giving you a consistent floor of 9 PPR points, that's someone who's definitely going to be relevant as at worst a wide receiver 3. And then the last guy in this tier, Jacoby Myers going up against the Saints. It's a good matchup. They are top 7 in points per game allowed. Jacoby's actually coming off his worst game of the season, even early on when Devontae Adams was there. It was still his worst. I do think he can have a bounce back here. He's been productive. I think the ceiling is just what's kind of sketchy. Some of these other guys you can see or have seen these huge explosive games. Tough to fully trust that in this Raiders offense. Now shifting into tier 7, going to start off this tier with Xavier Worthy. And I was someone who was very in on Worthy heading into the season. It's fair to say he has not really panned out, but we might be starting to see the breakout here for fantasy. Maybe a little late for some people, but if you have him, could be playable this week. In back-to-back weeks, he has been targeted 11 times and had 3 carries. He has put up 19.6 and 20.5 PPR points. And I did see an interesting quote from Matt Nagy where he was talking about the similarities between Rashee Rice's late season breakout in 2023 and then Xavier Worthy's kind of later season breakout this year. And it was something that I didn't necessarily expect to happen. And the main reason for that is that Xavier Worthy had a ton of opportunities early on in the season. With the injury to Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy was like a starting wide receiver from day one. So he's getting those starting reps the entire season and really hadn't showed us a ton. Couple big plays here or there, but very little consistency, was not commanding targets. The difference with Rashee Rice is that Rashee Rice was not getting starting usage early on in the season. He was in a very gross committee, but he was very efficient on a per route basis. So with his opportunities, he was making the most of them. Rashee Rice's huge breakout was not him all of a sudden like completely like doing a 180 and being an amazing player. It was really just a result of him getting more work. Obviously, he produced at a higher level, but he was showing the signs early on. Xavier Worthy really hadn't shown a ton, but if he's going to break out here and, he's playable for you, then go ahead. Hopefully he continues balling out. Then I'm going to go with Khalil Shakir going up against the Jets. Kind of a tough player to rank at this point. His calling card had been his consistency. Week 16 goes 2 for 22. Still someone who I think is more often than not going to have a pretty decent floor, but this is a Bills offense that is going to spread the ball around, so he's my wide receiver 33. Then I have DK Metcalf going up against the Bears. It's just tough to rank DK any higher here. I know like his over-under continues to look good, but the dude has not gone for over 70 yards since week 7. The production just has not been there consistently. JSN dominating the targets, dominating the production. Metcalf is like a back-end wide receiver 3 for me this week. Then I'm going to go with Darnell Mooney going up against the Commanders. Had a solid game with Penix, 5 for 82. I do think Penix being able to drive the ball down the field. Mooney's been a big play threat. I think those things can gel here. I guess it's like pretty much all or nothing this week, but in the future, do think this could be a fun connection. And then wrapping up this tier with Jalen McMillan going up against the Panthers. I could see the argument if you think I have him too low here. He has been super productive in his last 3 games, 4 for 59 and a touchdown, 5 for 75 and a touchdown, and then 5 for 57 and a touchdown. I guess my hesitancy here with Jalen McMillan is that a lot of it is pretty touchdown dependent. Obviously, he's scoring the touchdowns, so they're going to count. But if you remove the touchdowns, 5 for 59, 7 for 55, 5 for 57, people would not be clamoring to start him. Now, obviously, he's on a good offense. He's clearly been a factor getting into the end zone. But I do think there are a couple of other guys here where they could just as easily hit on a 3-game touchdown streak, right? Is there a significant difference between him and Darnell Mooney aside from the touchdowns? And I don't know if Jalen McMillan is significantly more likely to get into the end zone than a guy like Darnell Mooney. Maybe you can make that argument this week with the Bucks being number 1 in implied points, but I like McMillan here as a back-end wide receiver 3. And then my final tier 8, pretty much starting out the wide receiver 4s. My wide receiver 37 is going to be Deebo Samuel, and I think this is a very interesting spot. This is a good matchup on paper here. The issue here for Deebo is that he had just been a complete non-factor. Week 11 through week 15, he had scored under 7 PPR points in all 5 of them. So completely unplayable, just an awful fantasy option. Then he goes out week 16, drops 25.1 PPR points. I mean, almost assuredly on your bench. And now we're in this spot where if you have him, I could see the temptation to throw him back in there. On paper, good matchup. For me, I just have a tough time trusting it. If a dude's broken 7 points one time in the last 6, with my money on the line, I don't really want to bank on him having a good performance. Could totally be wrong. I would have been wrong not starting him in week 16, but he just consistently has not produced. So Deebo, my wide receiver 37. Then I have Josh Downs going up against the Giants. Super talented wide receiver, solid week 15, 3 for 61 and a touchdown. I just think with the Colts being 7.5 point favorites, the passing volume's probably not going to be there. We saw they are totally fine, not giving Richardson a million pass attempts, just dominating on the ground with Jonathan Taylor. I think it could be a very similar game script here in week 17. Then I have Jerry Jeudy going up against the Dolphins. Honestly, just pretty awful what Kevin Stefanski has done here with Jerry Jeudy. You finally get him someone who's just going to go out and sling it. Jameis Winston, obviously turning the ball over, but having a lot of passing volume. Jerry Jeudy having a career year, balling out for fantasy. Then you pivot to Dorian Thompson-Robinson, and DTR pretty much has the same negatives as Jameis, but he just has none of the upside, especially for fantasy, which is what we care about here. So Jerry Jeudy went from just consistently balling out to 2 receptions for 20 yards, and it does just seem like an extreme fall off because with Winston as the starter, I'd gotten to the point where Jeudy was a locked-in wide receiver 1. Now he is a wide receiver 4 for me, but I do think the quarterback change, dictates that. And then my final guy here, Jaden Reed, going up against the Vikings. Could see an argument for him kind of being in a lower tier, but he's my wide receiver 40. The Vikings are allowing the most points per game to the wide receiver position, and he has scored at least 11 in 3 of his last 4. Big play threat, not a super consistent volume guy, doesn't have a super high floor, but we're getting into wide receiver 40 territory. They're not all going to be, amazing plays. But that is going to wrap it up for my wide receiver rankings. If you guys enjoy the video, hit that like button, subscribe. Likely will not be updating these later on in the week, with the holidays, but we'll continue to answer questions. So if you have them later on in the week, feel free to still drop them. Thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.